A large number of amendments that came in. The Judiciary Committee staff were attempting to be diligent, as they should, and therefore we wanted to be prepared, which is evidence of us coming at a certain time, and so we are delighted that we have the opportunity. We feel that we wanted to make sure we give you the very best, and they were reviewing amendments yesterday up until the time that we arrived. Again, I want to thank my colleague for his presence here and his generosity. We are here to discuss H.R. 1585, the Violence Against Women Act of 2019. H.R. 1585 will reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. This has been a long journey since 2017, and we are delighted that this is legislation that is a landmark legislation and first enacted, as many know, in 1994. This legislation was enacted in response to the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence and the significant impact of such violence on the lives of women. It is estimated that more than 2 million adults, more than 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence annually. That is why this piece of legislation is essential. The law has been reauthorized 3 times in 2000, 2005, and 2013. It was supposed to be reauthorized in 2010, but it took a long time for the Congress to come together on some important additions. During each reauthorization, VAWA would make various meaningful improvements. Even with this progress, however, domestic and sexual violence remains a significant and widespread problem. H.R. 1585, therefore, continues that tradition, is intended to make modifications, as Congress has done in the past, to all previous reauthorization of VAWA. The bill is a bipartisan bill reflecting a reasonable and compromise approach to reauthorize this bill, and particularly the grant programs. These moderate enhancements will address the many growing and unmet needs of victims and survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and does provide a provision on human trafficking. H.R. 1585 expands protections for vulnerable populations such as youth, survivors without shelter, Native American women, and LGBTQ. It also is gender neutral, impacting those who are victims. The bill increases authorized funding for the Rape Prevention and Education Program, specifically authorizes programs addressing sexual harassment, and provides the tools and the funding for prosecutors and law enforcement to make a difference. In addition, it increases funding for VAWA Consolidated Youth Grants, which provides prevention education that engages men and boys as allies and promotes healthy relationship as keys to reducing gender-based violence. Finally, this bill was supported by the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women, a coalition of more than 200 domestic violence groups, and I can assure you, we've listened to each and every one of them. They have had a viable and visible presence as they have been on the front line of victims. This is a very important piece of legislation that has expired since September 2019. Certainly, there have been an extensive amount of work to pass this bill, and that was 2018, and it's been extensive work to pass this bill to seek bipartisan compromise. We've finally come to that point, and we're very pleased to be able to do this on behalf of survivors. So I look forward to discussing this legislation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much,
time.
Mr. Jackson-Lee. And Mr. Klein, I know you gave your, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
No, Mr. Chairman, I gave my statement yesterday. I appreciate the comments of the gentlelady. I share many of her goals, if not specifically with the legislation itself, but appreciate her comments.
Well, I thank you both for being here, and I don't have any questions. Mr. Hastings?
I have no questions.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, and thank you for reconvening the hearing, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I want to thank my friend, first of all, because there are certainly areas in here in which we agree. I want to particularly thank her for her work on the Native American area, where this builds on, honestly, what was done several years ago, and I am very, very supportive of that and appreciate my friend's work. I do have a couple questions. I would actually direct them to our side as much as your side. Is there any reason why we didn't reauthorize the existing law while we were working on this law? Because we did let it last, and I will say, we did that when we were in the majority. So, and I know you had the opportunity in the spending bill, and the Speaker chose not to. What's the rationale? Why didn't we just make sure we kept our baseline bill in while we worked toward a new reauthorization?
Mr. Chairman, the best of all worlds would have been for us to meet the expiration deadline in 2018, and I can assure you that we worked on this with our Republican friends and colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. our preceding chairman, who was leading. I personally worked and attempted to secure the collaboration. We obviously put more money in it for individual funding, stop grants, which are utilized by prosecutors and others. We made it gender neutral. We added sexual stalking. We did have the lockbox in there at that time that indicated if you had a conviction, and then if you had a misdemeanor conviction, that you would have your weapon locked up. Again, this is not a gun bill. This is a life-saving bill. And I just think that was a challenge to have a meeting of the minds. And on the extension, I think the idea was to ensure that you had the fullest review and overview of this legislation and pass and put before the Congress a solid piece of legislation that had all elements, i.e., working with Native American women. We really dug deep to listen to them, to find out what would work, and to find out what could be compliant with the law, to provide them the overwhelmingly needed kind of protections they needed. So I think it was not pointing the finger, but it was probably some challenge to get a complete meeting of the mind in the last Congress. And then in the instance of this Congress, we really wanted to put forward the bill that answered the questions of these 200 advocacy groups.
And again, I think there's plenty of blame to go around here. This isn't just directed at my friends in the majority. I said this in my own conference last year. It was an enormous mistake not to keep the existing law in place. We should have done that when we were in the majority. Frankly, I think you've made the same mistake, I'm sad to say, by not reauthorizing you through, because I find it very unlikely that this bill will pass the United States Senate or be signed by the president. And I say that as somebody who's going to vote for the bill. But it's not bipartisan now. It's not going to make it through the Senate. And we're going to be in this, until we finally come to an agreement, we're going to be in this prolonged period with nothing in place. And that, in my view, is a tragedy. It should have never, ever happened. I've got a particular point of view, and if, you know, one of the things that we are, as a party, very interested in, frankly, are protecting children who've survived abortion. Is there anything in this bill that would offer them protections of a female child?
Ms. Cole, can you repeat that question?
Yes, ma'am. You know, as you may know, we have a Born Alive protection bill that we're trying to get heard in the bill, and now, obviously, some of these children, statistically half, are female. Is there any, would they be protected under this particular legislation?
Well, I believe they would.
So they would receive life-giving, sustaining care if they were an abortion survivor? That's good to know. I'm thrilled if that's the case.
Let me clarify that response. I thought that response, it provides protection for children, but as it relates to your particular question, it would not be germane, and so it is not in this legislation.
How is it not germane? And both of you can respond to questions if you like. You're both attorneys, I'm not, so I have a lot of respect for your opinions, but how's it not germane if it's a female child and this is the Violence Against Women Act? And
Mr. Chairman, I know that there is no language to prevent sex selection abortion in the bill. I think that's the issue you're getting to. It does make eligible groups like Planned Parenthood for funding in the bill. So there is funding for abortion providers in this bill, and that would be problematic for those who want to protect all women, including those who have not yet been born.
It's not germane.
They're the most vulnerable of all, can't speak for themselves, you know, totally dependent on other care. And I find it strange that there would be no protections for people in that situation.
Ms. Cole, if I might.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been on the Judiciary Committee and fully appreciate the Hyde Amendment, fully appreciate the question of abortion and the question that's been raised on the floor of the House. Although those are worthy issues that should be debated, in this basic framework of the Violence Against Women Act, there are no provisions dealing with abortion There are no provisions. You might be alluding to an individual who has been unfortunately victimized and may be engaged in any number of activities. We do not have any abortion language in that legislation.
This
It
would be
deals,
a child that had survived an abortion.
Yeah.
In other words, that was outside the womb, and, would that person receive protection?
that clearly is an issue that would be framed under an abortion question. We have no abortion questions, no Hyde Amendment issues in this legislation. Not to say that that may be discussed, as you all are attempting to do, but it is not in the Violence Against Women Act.
I understand that, but I think it should be, because again, it's not really a Hyde issue. Hyde issue is about government funding of abortions. That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is a child that survived an abortion. Would they have the protections under this law? I mean, I don't see why they wouldn't, and I'm disappointed our friends have not allowed this to come up on the floor and be discussed or added here in the amendment. Let me just end with this, because we can go round and round. I respect both my friends, and I don't want to take too much time. But I do urge my friends to think about it this way. We have now, through bipartisan failure, in my view, allowed the Violence Against Women Act to lapse. You've got a product here that I think will certainly pass the House, but I think it'll certainly not pass the Senate. It would certainly not be signed by the President if it did. So I would urge my friends to, while they continue to work on this, and hopefully we can find common ground, and there's certainly some areas in here I support. I very much support my friends' work on tribal communities and Native women. It's excellent work, built on what was done. But, as a practical matter, we ought to bring up the existing act and get it reauthorized, so while this gets sorted out politically and the two sides, we don't go through this gap where there's literally no existing law. That's a failure. That's a mistake, in my view, Mr. Chairman. And I hope that at some point we'll address that. Now, if this speedily becomes law, that won't be a problem. But I kind of doubt that's going to be the case. So we shouldn't be without an authorized piece of legislation that we both agree on, that could easily pass in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, that could easily pass the United States Senate, that the President, I assume, would sign, although, to be fair, I've never asked him that. I assume he would. We ought to build that insurance in as we go forward. But I appreciate my friends being here. Look forward to the debate on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and thank you. And I just want to, for the record, point out that the Born Alive Infants Protection Act of 2002 was enacted on August 5th, 2002. It's an act of Congress. Extends legal protection to an infant born alive after a failed attempt at induced abortion. It was signed by President George W. Bush. And I think, I think the law is pretty clear on this. But in any event, I just wanted to point that out for the record. Mr. Raskin.
That out at this point, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo the ranking member's appreciation for having the hearing today. I wanted to ask Ms. Jackson-Lee, I think back, I wasn't here during the three previous reauthorizations of this bill, but I remember some big bipartisan votes. Sometimes inertia is our problem here. I don't expect a big bipartisan vote tomorrow, not like we've seen historically. And it does seem that a simple extension of current law, while we tried, I know you mentioned in your comments, the extensive work at bipartisan compromise, but while we were continuing that work, reauthorizing current law would give us a pathway to keep the protections on the books. If we don't see this bill move forward in the Senate, as I certainly don't expect it to move forward, do you think we'll see the Judiciary Committee coming back with a simple extension so that these important protections will continue while what is certainly a contentious discussion also continues?
Let me thank the gentleman for his interest in the Violence Against Women Act and indicate that one of the strengths of this legislation is the vast involvement. We all involve our constituents, with the vast involvement of national constituents who happen to be women who are Republican, Democrats, and Independents. They believe this legislation should be passed by Republicans and Democrats. They believe that this bill is life-saving, and they believe that the many agencies that are dependent upon the funding, including police and prosecutors, including continuing to stop the backlog of reviewing rape kits, is so vital. The work that we did with Native American women in particular to allow the prosecution of those who violate them, the epidemic of domestic violence. We spent time talking to law enforcement who really indicated one of the most dangerous acts of a law enforcement officer is answering the call of a domestic violence in terms of the people involved and that officer. This bill will address that question. It is a bill that deals with all of humanity, if I might say. There are people, men and women, who face domestic violence, and as well, it, I think, does something very important, continues to work with men and boys to ensure that they have a different attitude about interacting with women, and it protects children in outreach programs. So I would make the argument that I am stretching my imagination as to what could be an element of so much so that they wouldn't draw some bipartisan support. We have a co-sponsor. I'm going to yield to my good friend, and I just want to say this, that the recent intervention of scoring is not something that we attempted to draw on or to provoke. We wanted to move a bill that would reach the concerns of all of the advocates, and we believe that we have worked very hard to do that.
And the result of all of that, that hard work and that stretching yielded how many Republican votes on this bipartisan idea in the committee?
Let me yield to my colleague.
I'm not aware of any Republican votes in committee.
And that's, I'm glad I'm not on the Judiciary Committee. The work you all are tasked with doing is some of the hardest work in the institution. If it was easy, it doesn't get referred to the Judiciary Committee. But you all find a way to work together and move forward on a lot of issues. The issues my friend from Texas just went through, those are hard issues for our constituents who are grappling with them. They are not hard intellectual issues to get behind. We do want to incorporate our men and boys in this effort. We do want to provide safe spaces for our women. We do want to reach into our Native American communities. You go right on down that list that you made. Those are the kinds of things that brought the 371-1 reauthorization vote in 2000. Those are the kinds of principles that brought the 415-4 reauthorization vote in 2006. And yet, on a committee that has to work so well together on so many difficult issues, you all found not one person on the other side of the aisle that you could work with to move this forward. What that suggests to me, and I know the gentlelady is sincere when she talks about the bipartisan work that went into it, what that suggests to me is that work just can't possibly be done, because I know the men and women who serve on the Judiciary Committee. There is more common ground than that, and it stretches my imagination to see how a bill that passes with zero Republican support, apparently crafted in a way knowing that it was going to get zero Republican support, is going to pass a Republican Senate and get signed by a Republican president. But these issues are so important. We need a bill to be signed. We need a bill to be signed. We want a bill to be signed. I've been watching my friend from Virginia during the questions yesterday and today. He started his career working in this field. He wants a bill to go to the president's desk. He wants to be a yes vote on the board, as do my other friends on the Judiciary Committee, but we found not one. That is it the gentlelady's position that we did all the work we could do to find a bipartisan pathway forward and we just failed? And so those efforts are behind us. I just believe we can do better, and I know the gentlelady is one who has great hope as well.
Mr. Woodall, I would never cede the point that we failed. We continue to dialogue with our Republican friends. The Republicans had an opportunity to bring the Violence Against Women Act in the last Congress. As I indicated, we started work on this almost 3 years ago with the then existing chair. We were in constant meetings. We had almost to the brink some resolution of it. I think it's difficult for me to analyze what intervention would come in after we would leave a meeting and had some consensus. But in addition, the bill was ready to be worked on with leadership's involvement, and leadership just decided, Republican leadership just decided not to bring this bill to the floor. And I think that when you decide to bring a bill to the floor, there's opportunity, particularly under Republican leadership, to then craft a bill. As we well know, we're before the Rules Committee. There's a manager's amendment that goes forward, and all of this could have been done with the framework of this legislation. Last session, it was not done. So again, I want my friend to certainly be a supporter, and we'll see how this proceeds through the regular order on the floor with our leadership has promised to occur. You will be looking at the amendments, you'll be making the decisions, but I can tell you that this is a solid piece of legislation that tried to fill in the gaping gaps dealing with protecting women around the nation. And again, what I've heard from law enforcement officers, along with sexual harassment, stalking, and dealing with teenagers on college campuses, is a continued epidemic of domestic violence and the great need for this legislation.
I stipulate that that's true. I hear the same thing from my law enforcement community, which is why I'm so frustrated that what seems to be a pattern of bills coming to the House for things that could have been 415 to 4 votes, like the 2006 reauthorization of VAWA, turn into us against them votes. I'll ask Mr. Klein, did you serve in the Virginia legislature? Did you have that privilege?
I did, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the question. I served for 16 years in the Virginia legislature, was on the Courts of Justice Committee. But just as important to that, you referenced my first job out of law school was on a stop grant prosecuting domestic violence cases. So I know the importance of this bill, the importance of extending this law, and maybe I was blessed not to have the experience of having been in the House last year when this was up for debate. I know that there was an attempt at the end of the session to extend it that failed. So with the new Congress, we had a new leadership that had a decision to make, whether to try to continue in a bipartisan vein or to push the envelope, as it were. And I think what you're seeing here is the result of trying to broaden this legislation in a way and that caused it to lose support among Judiciary Committee members and likely Republicans on the House floor as well. But it's my hope that we can regain that bipartisan support for the bill. I know there are nearly 11 members of Judiciary who stand ready to vote for this bill as it was, if it were to be extended.
Well, and let me ask the question that the gentlelady from Texas posed about gaps in the legislation. I am rarely satisfied with just extending what we did last time. We've got a lot of bright men and women here. You weren't here the last time we did this, Mr. Klein. I would expect that our new members have something to add. If we take the current language or the historical language as our base case, do you think there is a legislation plus solution? I mean, can you look at the last reauthorization, and can you also find some things that you would like to see improved and tightened and made to serve your constituency better? Are the Judiciary Republicans asking for the same old thing or nothing at all, or do you see a pathway to do even more and do it in a collaborative bipartisan way?
Collaborative bipartisan negotiation could potentially result in some changes to the bill on both sides, but starting from the base bill, that bipartisan code that was current law and allowed to lapse would be the natural starting point. And if we could just offer an extension, I know that, speaking for Ranking Member Collins, we would commit to engage in those bipartisan negotiations. And
I'm unsatisfied by simple extensions, but that failure is not as large as the failure of having the law lapse altogether. And I appreciate what you're saying, that we may not get everything we want, but we don't have to fail entirely. We could absolutely move move the ball forward. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And let me just say, I think it would be a missed opportunity if we just merely extended the current law, because I think there are some major improvements here. Now, I know for some there's some controversy. I know the gun lobby has come out against this bill, and there are some other controversial issues that some want to inject in this bill. But here's the deal. At the end of this process, we'll get to vote yes or no on the bill. Hopefully, as Mr. Cole has suggested, there's some will join with us and actually pass the bill. The Senate will probably do something different. We'll have a conference committee. We'll hopefully resolve differences in the conference committee, and then it'll come back here, and it'll go there, and hopefully we'll end up with something that more people can support. But I think, I have no idea what the Senate is willing to take or not, and I don't want to legislate by thinking about what every senator wants or doesn't want. We ought to do the best we can here, and then have the process work its way through. So anyway, Ms. Torres, do you have questions or? Oh, sure, go ahead.
Some brief remarks. Each year, nearly 8 million women are victims of sexual assault, stalking, rape, or dating violence. 17,000 victims report that firearms were used as part of the abuse. So we can't simply continue with the status quo. We have to do something. We have to do more to help our daughters, our mothers, and our granddaughters get beyond this violence. And this bill makes several important improvements on that status quo. To name just a few, it allows Native American tribes to prosecute those who are responsible for bringing violence to Native American reservations. It keeps firearms out of the hands of abusers and stalkers, and it protects the housing rights of victims and survivors. If that is not important enough of an issue to support this bill, to give it a yes vote, then I'm not sure what it is or what it will take. So congratulations, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for bringing this forward to us. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
May I just comment very briefly on the gentlelady's astuteness? First of all, let me thank her. One of her legislative initiatives dealing with Indian Native American women and her issue of the violence that occurs, we were able to submit and pass an amendment with the support of Republican members, an amendment dealing with reporting on the violence dealing with Native American women. We work with Mr. Gomer on a female genital mutilation bill, which is in this legislation. Mr. Fitzpatrick's health bill dealing with the health services that are so much needed is in this bill. To my recollection, these are Republican members. Never before, to my recollection, have we had a score on the Violence Against Women Act, an intervention of an agency that has nothing to do with protecting women against violence. Now we have a score of an outside entity, the National Rifle Association. There were many opportunities, and I think you are right, many opportunities for Republican engagement, and the evidence are the bills that are in that were proposed by Republicans. And I think that surely is a sign of bipartisanship, but many opportunities to actually be in the mix of the mashed potatoes of the bill, if you will, getting it to where it is. I, too, have the confidence that a Senate will produce a bill and that we will have the opportunity for conference and we will have some place to start.
Mr. Burgess. Okay, oh, I forgot, yeah, okay, great. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're talking a lot about bipartisanship in this bill, and I just want to share with you my experience, which has been a lack of bipartisanship. And let me tell you, I'm the co-chairwoman of the Women's Caucus in Congress, and so I reached out to my Democratic colleague, and because this is such an important issue to me, because I'm a survivor of domestic violence, I said, this is one of the issues I really want to work on in a bipartisan fashion. And so at one point, she didn't know exactly at the beginning who the sponsor was going to be, and then it was determined it was going to be Representative Bass. And so my office reached out several times to Representative Bass's office to try to get a meeting to talk about it so we could have a bipartisan bill. and it just never happened. We were never able to meet. And then in Judiciary Committee, I offered an amendment that basically would protect the privacy and safety of women and children, and was told by the chairman and Representative Bass that, you know, the language was too vague, and so on and so forth. And so then I asked Representative Bass, right, in Judiciary Committee hearing, if she would be agreeable to meeting with me so we could work on this language in a bipartisan fashion. And she said, quote, well, let me just say to my colleague on the other side of the aisle that I would be more than happy to work with you so that we could come up with language that we could both agree with. All right? And so that I thought, wow, that's great. So then my office reached out to Representative Bass's office on, right after that meeting on Friday, March 15th, and I have an email here saying, hey, can we meet at certain dates? No response. Then we emailed her office again on Friday, March 22nd, say, hey, can we meet about what you said in Judiciary Committee? Again, no response. So my experience has been there has been a lack of bipartisanship, at least talking to me, and I'd like to submit this for the record. It's a copy of the Judiciary Committee hearing and noted where Representative Bass said she would work with me, and then a copy of the emails where we reached out and were not even responded to.
Without objection.
Thank you. Also, I want to point out that I'm also on the Judiciary Committee, and I believe that this version of the Violence Against Women Act has the government forces domestic violence shelters to place biological males who identify as women with biological females. And so my question for Mrs. Jackson-Lee and Mr. Klein is, do you think it is...
Excuse me, can you just clarify? So,
Yes.
they're not biological males. I mean, they're transgender women who you're referring to, and a transgender woman is not a man. So I just wanted to clarify that for the record.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I disagree. I believe that if they have all of the parts of the body as a man, that they are a biological man.
Yeah, well,
And so...
we strongly disagree. Thank you.
And so basically, I wanted to say, do you think that a woman would feel uncomfortable if there was a domestic violence shelter that didn't have the capacity to have separate rooms, and instead everyone is grouped together and possibly taking group showers? Do you think it would be uncomfortable for a woman that has probably been abused and maybe sexually abused to have to be placed in the same circumstance as a biological male who now, who I should say believes, well, not, how is the word, identifies as a woman?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for your participation, Congresswoman, on the Judiciary Committee. It is vital and it is important. Let me also thank Ms. Bass for her leadership and certainly her sensitivity and engagement with you during that discourse. I do want to acknowledge that you have submitted an amendment on the very same point, which the Rules Committee, of which you're a member, will have every opportunity to make in order or not. So you'll have that opportunity to discuss that here in the Rules Committee. I think when we had the debate in the Judiciary Committee, there was little documentation that these incidences occurred. In addition, our advocacy groups, as I said, are across the political spectrum, and none of the advocacy groups wanted to see to any point that the facilities that they had contact with had any incidences happening when a transgender person would be there running for their lives, and that's what these facilities are. So I think that, one, the amendment has been posed for consideration by the Rules Committee, and two, when we had the debate, there was not sizable documentation that we had a problem to have a solution for. It was a solution looking for a problem. I also just want to reiterate again that this scoring intervention came in the last 2 weeks, and it is shocking to us because, again, it's not restricting guns, it's not taking guns away, it is to protect the victims who this bill is for, the Violence Against Women Act, and to protect the victims. So I would just make the point again that we hope that the amendment will answer the Congresswoman's concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Klein, in Judiciary Committee, there was talk, in fact, I brought it up, and I think others brought it up, that there is, in fact, evidence of women feeling uncomfortable with biological male being with them. There was a case in California where 8 women have sued in a homeless shelter where they are being, because the shelter receives federal funding, they're being forced into taking in biological males and placing them with biological women, and the women have to take group showers. And there was other, lewd acts that were going on by this biological male. So my question is, do you think that perhaps this bill would infringe on the safety and privacy of women?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question, and the gentlelady did raise the issue at committee that there are instances, reported instances of women being concerned about the lack of separation in certain facilities designed to protect victims of domestic and sexual violence. I was on the board of a shelter. Everyone deserves protection from sexual and domestic violence. Women deserve it, men deserve it, children deserve it, gay deserve it, straight deserve it. Everyone deserves protection from sexual and domestic violence. And so we have to make sure that the law, while protecting those who are genuine victims, does not allow for opportunities for those who are not genuine, who are in fact predators, to seek out victims for further abuse. And so I don't believe that this bill adequately provides adequate protection in that regard. And so I associate myself with the gentlelady's remarks and wish that it could be strengthened.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I have another question for Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, what are your thoughts on this proposal removing human trafficking as a primary grant purpose?
Well, we continue to see human and sex trafficking as a problem, most notably due to the lack of border enforcement in this country. And if we seek to address it, we need to provide law enforcement with all available options, and that includes funding under this legislation to fight human trafficking and sex trafficking. And so we do lament the lack of inclusion of trafficking in this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have in my hands a letter signed by various anti-trafficking organizations, and it says, on behalf of the undersigned anti-trafficking organizations, including 18 survivor-led organizations working to support sex trafficking survivors across the country, we respectfully write to express our strongest support for preserving the protections granted to sex trafficking survivors in the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and I'd like to submit this for the record as
Without
well.
objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I thank the gentlelady for a comment.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, she has the time, so you
Okay.
yielding to Ms. Jackson Lee, or?
No, I was just going, unless she wants to say something, sure.
yes, I was just indicating, thank you for your comment on that, as I was trying to respond to. Ms. Congresswoman Wagner and myself have worked together to restore sex trafficking through an amendment that provides sex trafficking victims and survivors receive services through the VAWA grant programs. And I think that is a very important element, and the amendment is bipartisan, and Congresswoman Wagner and I have worked on this before, along with other women who have worked on both the sex trafficking and human trafficking issue. We hope that the amendment can be made in order to respond to Congresswoman Lesko's concerns.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, Mr. Klein, this bill takes away gun rights of a defendant who has an ex parte order of protection filed against him or her. Do you think a person should have gun rights taken away if they don't have a chance to defend themselves in court?
Well, everyone deserves due process, particularly when constitutional rights are involved. And so there is concern that this bill would allow those constitutional rights to be deprived, or a person to be deprived of those rights without due process. Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman and Mr. Klein, this current version of the VAWA bill also forces prisons to place biological males who identify as women in with women. In the United Kingdom, there have been a case where a man who identified as a woman was put in a woman's prison and raped women. Do you think that is safe for the women?
Well, Mr. Chairman, once again, I share the gentlelady's concern that sufficient protections should be in the bill when you are dealing with facilities, whether they are prisons, whether they are shelters, to ensure that all victims are provided adequate protection from domestic and sexual violence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm done with my questions, but do you want me to talk about my amendments now, or should I wait?
Why don't you wait until we
Okay.
go through, then we could,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think everybody here wants to make sure that everybody is protected. That's not the question. I just have to say, for the record, I do have a problem when we talk about transgender individuals as being predators or somehow not deserving of protection themselves. This House spoke, I think that was last week, we voted in a bipartisan way to stand up to discrimination against transgender individuals, and I'm proud that we did that. And I find it frustrating to have this discussion move in this direction, because I don't think it's fair.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chair, would you yield?
Well,
Would you yield? Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. We shouldn't discriminate against anyone. But what I've been told that this bill does is has the federal government, through federal law, this law, forcing, let's say, domestic violence shelters that are accepting funds from the Violence Against Women Act to take in a biological male and put him next to a biological woman, whether they're equipped for it or not. I mean, I'm on an advisory council of a domestic violence shelter in Arizona, and talk to them. Some of their facilities have separate living quarters, and so then that would work. I mean, this bill doesn't, in my amendments, don't in any way stop any shelter from taking in anyone, and doesn't discriminate against anyone. But what we're saying is that we're forcing all domestic violence shelters, where some don't have separate facilities, to take in biological males and put them right next to biological women. I just don't think that's safe for women. Thank you.
Mr. Klein, did you want?
No, Mr. Chairman, I'd say that in addition to sharing the gentlelady's remarks, concern about not just adequate facilities, but also situations and scenarios being created where genuine victims are not provided protection. In fact, that opportunities are being created for predators, not people who are transgendered or gay or straight or anything, but people who would prey on victims to take advantage of holes in the law.
We had a witness, if I might, Mr. Chairman, a judge who indicated that she has not seen one victim that's LGBTQ come into her courtroom suffering from a form of violence, who was making it up, and that these people are desperate. They need protection. This bill provides protection, and I think that there are many ways. I noticed that Ms. Lesko has an amendment regarding that issue. She has an amendment regarding the gun issue. She's been able to submit them and have discussion, but the point is, there was not ready data to indicate that this was a problem, nor was it a problem raised by advocates who are the ones representing the many homes and facilities that take in people who are desperate.
My comments are to a different issue, to predators.
And I think, I guess my point is there's absolutely no reason to believe that transgender women pose a threat to other women in shelters. And I think that's where I felt this conversation was going. And so maybe we should all move on to something else, because I don't think it's going to end well. So anybody, Ms. Scanlon?
Yes, Sunday night, just before midnight, one of my constituents was at home with her 3 children, asleep, when her ex-boyfriend broke into her house, entered the bedroom where she was asleep with her 5-year-old, and shot her. He then tried again, and if his gun hadn't jammed, she would be dead. So there was an outstanding protection order against him. So Congresswoman Jackson-Lee, can you speak to how that fits the boyfriend loophole that this version of VAWA would seek to deal with?
Let me express my concern and sadness for your constituent, how many stories all of us could recount. That is exactly why we have closed that loophole in this legislation, and based upon not only the incidences reported by members of Congress, but by the advocacy groups who see this all the time. And again, it is a restriction on the individual who has had an outstanding offense. It is a lockbox. It is not the undermining of the Second Amendment. It is not taking the gun away. It is a requirement that the gun must be locked up in circumstances related to the interaction or to maintain it and have it under supervision. So I believe the gun that covers intimate partners is a good closing of the loophole and might have helped in the instance of your constituent. I'm certainly grateful that an additional factor was that the gun jammed, but certainly these are terrible situations that we want to avoid.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to defer most of the questions I was going to ask in the interest of time, but I just wanted to make a couple of comments, partly based on what Ms. Jackson-Lee just mentioned, and that relates to the boyfriend or the dating partner loophole. And there's no question in the United States, you look at marriage rates are dropping precipitously, and many people are choosing to get married later in life, but that doesn't mean people aren't together in relationships. And the fact that we don't have dating partners and intimate partners in the law simply creates this gigantic loophole. And to me, that's one of the most important things about this bill. And I think it was, I don't know whether he was a Republican or Democrat, but Racine County Sheriff Christopher Smalling testified at a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee back a few years ago, and he said, dangerous boyfriends can be just as scary as dangerous husbands. They hit just as hard, and they fire their guns with the same deadly force. But also note that as it relates to stalkers, a study of intimate partner homicides and attempted homicides involving female victims in 10 major U.S. cities found that 76% of those murders and 85% of attempted murders of women were preceded by at least one incident of stalking in the year before the attack. So I think these changes are necessary, are needed. I appreciate comments made by my colleague, Mr. Cole, about simply extending the existing law, but I think that would dramatically reduce, if not eliminate, any real chance that the expansions in this bill and the closing of loopholes would ever happen. So I'm pleased to have the bill before the committee and hope that we see passage in the next couple of days.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Klein and Mr. Jackson-Lee, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your testimony. Mr. Klein, thank you for coming again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And you can leave. So thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for the courtesies of the Rule Committee. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And I know we have a couple of more people who want to testify. Ms. Scanlon has an amendment you want to testify on. I know Ms. Lesko does too.
Mr. Chairman, just as I close, let me again thank Ms. Bass and the Judiciary Committee and staff. This has been a long journey that we worked on for now almost 3 years.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon, you want to submit yours for the record? Yeah. It's up to you. Yeah.
Right. So as a former Legal Services Board member and a director of a pro bono program, I know the importance of legal representation for vulnerable folks like those who have been subject to domestic violence. So too often, survivors are left to navigate the fallout of abuse alone, whether that means seeking custody, housing, medical care, employment protections, or other comprehensive care in the aftermath of abuse. The process can be complicated, and legal representation can make a critical difference. Sometimes that means a lawyer who can remove the abuser from the home. Sometimes it's an attorney who can help a survivor to get accommodations from an employer or access to medical care. So access to justice in our legal system is a crucial issue, and one of the key contributions of VAWA is that it recognizes the importance of legal assistance for survivors of domestic abuse. As with many social services, upfront investments cause long-term benefits and savings. That's why my amendment would ask the GAO to conduct a study about the economic benefits of investments in legal services under the jurisdiction of VAWA. So it's important that we have a full grasp of the importance of those investments so that my colleagues and I can continue pushing for robust investments in critical legal resources. So I urge my colleagues on this committee to make this amendment in order.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Ms. Scanlon? Hearing none, we'll now go to Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 amendments. Would you like me to explain them all together? Well, thank you. My Lesko number 3 amendment basically would allow defendants a chance to defend themselves before taking away their gun rights. In this bill, it would take away someone's gun rights through an ex parte order of protection. For instance, when I got an order of protection against my ex-husband, went to a justice of the peace, he wasn't present, so it is my understanding under this bill that his rights for gun would be taken away without him being able to even defend himself. So I'm concerned that in the cases where people have like an argument between husband and wife, or they're going to divorce, or whatever, that anybody can say anything, and then somebody's Second Amendment rights would be taken away. Just want them to have a chance to be able to defend themselves. My Lesko number 4 amendment, this amendment would protect faith-based organizations and religious entities from being forced to implement a standard or delivery of services that are inconsistent with their religious beliefs or moral convictions. Many of the domestic violence shelters and providers are currently organizations of faith, and so we wouldn't want them not to be able to serve these victims and have to choose between following their faith and serving victims. Of course, our nation was founded on religious liberty, and we should not be coercing shelters with a religious mission from exercising their faith. My Lesko number 5 amendment is the one that, these were all offered in Judiciary Committee as well. The privacy and safety of women and children basically is what I already talked about, this piece of legislation. It's very simple. It just says that a shelter should be allowed to protect the privacy and safety of victims in the shelter, whoever they are. And thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Lesko? Hearing none. Anybody else want to testify on any amendments? Hearing none, that closes the hearing portion on H.R. 1585. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 1585, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2019, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purpose of amendment, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-9, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Okay. As we just heard from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, this rule provides for consideration of H.R. 1585, Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, under a structured rule. This rule self-executes a manager's amendment and makes technical corrections. The rule also makes an order of 40 amendments, each debatable for 10 minutes. So you've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. My amendment would add to the text of the rule separate consideration of H.R. 962, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. This act would outlaw and penalize infanticide in the United States. House Republicans are taking a step to ensure that the right to life is preserved. Republicans have tried to bring this legislation up for consideration 26 times on the House floor, and all attempts have been unsuccessful. Since we are here considering the Violence Against Women Act, let's take the opportunity to ensure that women of all ages deserve protection from violence, including the innocent babies who have no way to speak up for themselves. At the very least, Mr. Chairman, a topic of this importance deserves debate and discussion on the floor of the House.
Thank you very much. You've heard the amendment from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Detanya? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Woodall.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move that we report an open rule to H.R. 1585. Heard a lot of discussion about trying to find a pathway to bipartisanship. Clearly, we didn't find it, but we could with an open rule on the floor tomorrow.
You've heard the gentleman's amendment. Any comment or discussion? I would probably, based on the discussion here, I doubt very much that would be the case. But in any event, any other discussion of the gentleman's amendment? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The opinion chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to get a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Detanya? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko?
Aye, and Mr. Chairman, hey, I did pension reform in my state bipartisan, so if we can do that, we can do this one too.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
I was confused. The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Woodall.
You've made a big effort to make the Rules Committee a stronger and more powerful institution, which I very much appreciate. I say that in all sincerity. Mr. Burgess has an amendment that was not made in order by the base text. I move that we make in order Mr. Burgess's amendment number 37 for consideration for tomorrow.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Is there any, I know there's one Burgess amendment in order, but you're talking about the other one. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion, chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I get a report?
Absolutely. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
I'm glad the good doctor wasn't here to see that. Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. Clerk report
Mr.
the
Chairman,
total.
no. 3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. The further amendments? Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 3 offered by myself, Ms. Lesko. This amendment eliminates the prohibition of gun possession and purchase for those with ex parte orders of protection and allows them to defend themselves in court.
You heard the Lesko amendment. Is there any discussion or questions? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call vote, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko?
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order and provide the necessary waivers for amendment number 4 offered by myself. This amendment states that faith-based organizations who provide protection from violence for women and children will be able to do so in accordance with their faith.
You heard the amendment from the gentlelady. Any comments or? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. You want to-
Roll call vote, please.
A roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall?
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko?
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Ms. Lesko.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 5 offered by myself. This amendment states nothing in this act or the amendments made by this act may be construed to compel a victim service provider to place a woman or child into a circumstance in which the woman or child has grounds to fear for violation of privacy or for his or her safety.
You've heard the gentlewoman's amendment. Any comments, discussion? I think we've already talked about this, so I'm not going to say anything. So hearing none, all those in favor of the Lesko amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
A roll call vote, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion? Is that a discussion or? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Murley? Aye. Mr. Murley, aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it, so the motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, will handle the rule for the majority. Ms. Lesko will handle it. And let me just, before I finish, thank everybody for your patience, and I apologize for the inconvenience of having to meet today, but sometimes things happen. So in any event, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.